Hey everybody, this is Chris with Overclockers Club. Guess what time it is? If you said motherboard time, you would be correct. Now I just finished up the review for this one. This is the MPG Z690 Carbon Wi-Fi. This motherboard supports DDR5, but if you're looking for a Z690 chipset that supports DDR4, well, they do have it. And this Tomahawk does come in two flavors. Both are Z690, but one supports DDR5, this one supports DDR4, and this is the one we'll be looking at today. Now, MSI has three levels or three tiers in their motherboard series. There's the MAG, the MPG, and an MEG. So you could look at them as the MAG is like the bottom level, which is not necessarily bad, but it's just the bottom level. Then there's the MPG in the middle and the MEG at the top. And as you go from one level to the other, you basically increase in features and options, and of course the pricing level also goes up as you go between MAG, MPG, and MEG. So we'll take a quick look around the box. This supports Intel 12th generation Alder Lake processors, CPUs. It's got the Z690 chipset, supports Optane memory, Lightning Gen 5, TPM 2.0. This is for your basically so that you can run Windows 11, the security compatibility there. And it says right there, Windows 11 compatible. Now let's look at the back of the box. All right, so the back of the box here, looking at the top left here, so we've got robust design power, 16 plus 1 phase power with the use of 70 amp smart power stage, quadruple M.2 connectors. So we've got onboard 4 slots basically for M.2 drives. We've got M.2 shield frozer. I think that's just the heat sink that they use. Lightning 20G, the latest USB 3.2 Gen 2x2, up to 20 gigabits per second. So that's nice. Wi-Fi 6 with Bluetooth. So we got 2.4 gigabits on the, Wi-Fi. Multi-user, multi-input, multi-output, and Bluetooth 5.2. Now this is Wi-Fi 6, not Wi-Fi 6E. There is a difference. And there's nothing wrong with 6. It's just 6E. Is a different animal, so I'll talk about that later. Audio Boost 5, 120 decibel, 32-bit DSD support. Over here, Lightning Gen 5, up to 128 gigabits a second on the bandwidth, compatible with PCIe 4.0 devices. Your LAN or your Ethernet port there, we've got 2.5 gig on that. That's nice. Server grade PCB. Extended heatsink design, M.2 shield frozer. Let's see, better thermals. Yeah, so you keep things cooler. Basically, you'll keep your transfer speeds higher. Now, this is a little hard to read, so I'm going to zoom in on that. And all of this information is available in the specifications tab for this motherboard. So if you want to go back and look at it, that's easy to do. But basically, it does support the 12th gen Alder Lake CPUs, which I mentioned that on the front of the box. The socket is LGA 1700. It is the Z690 chipset. Supports AMD Crossfire technology. Supports, okay, so your display interface, 4K at 60 Hertz as specified in HDMI 2.1. DisplayPort 1.4. It does require a CPU that has the onboard graphics. You can get the CPUs with and without that. So if that's important, you want to make sure you have that. Over here, we've got 4 slots for your RAM, DDR4 up to 5200 plus on your overclock. You've got 1 PCI 3.0 by 16, 1 PCI 3.0 by 1, 3 M.2 Gen 4 by 4, 64 gigabit per second slots, 1 M.2 Gen 3 times 4, 32 gigabits, 32 gigabit slots, and 6 SATA ports, 6 gigabits on those. We've got 1 USB 3.2 Gen 2 by 2 at 20 gigabits a second, which is your Type C USB. You've got 4 Gen 2, 4 USB 3.2 Gen 2, 10 gigabit slots there, ports, 3 are Type A, 1 is Type C. And we'll look at the I/O panel here off to the side here in a moment. It sort of shows that. You've got Intel 1225 V2.5 on the LAN, Wi-Fi 6. Yeah, we've kind of already gone over all that. So now let me move over to the I/O panel. And we'll see this when I get the board out. But there's a display port, an HDMI port. There's your little flash BIOS button. These are your USB ports here. So we've got a couple of Type A, let's see, or 2.0, USB 2.0 and USB 3.2, the blue ones. And then we've got red ones, which are your USB 3.2 Gen 2, 10 gigabits a second, Type A. And down here, you've got 3 of those actually. And there's a USB 3.2 Gen 2x2, 20 gigabits per second, Type C. And that's that little one down here at the bottom. 2.5 gig on the LAN. You've got 2 outlets there, 2 little receptacles for your Wi-Fi antenna, and then this is your input output here for your speakers, microphone, that kind of stuff. And you also have a little optical outlet too. All right, and now I'll get it out of the box, but first I will point out I am wearing my anti-static wrist strap. It is winter where you get a lot of static. I do have a humidifier in here, but still, for a couple dollar investment, $3 or $4, an anti-static wrist strap. I've got it grounded over here to the frame, which is grounded to the table, which is grounded to the outlet. It doesn't hurt to be safe. So this little box here has the Wi-Fi antennas in it. Spoiler alert, I already opened it. There you go, your antennas. Now, get the motherboard out. It's in its ESD or electrostatic discharge bag, protective bag. And we'll look at this stuff here in a minute. I think what I'll do is actually, I'll just go ahead and mount the board directly to my little test stand over here off to the side. All right, so we'll look at the top of the board here real quick, real briefly. I'll point out some of the features, and then I'll flip the board over so we can see what's on the underside. Not a whole lot of excitement there, but it's still worth looking at. Okay, so the first thing is your socket here. There's a protective plastic cover on there to protect the pins, and I always leave that on until I'm ready to put the CPU in. But I will open this and do a real quick inspection on the pins. I like to make sure there's no obvious damage, and those all look good. You can tell the way these things are lined up. If there's something wrong, it's usually pretty obvious, but that all looks good. So we'll close this back up. So what stands out, I like the way they've got on top of these heat sinks. They've got 1, 2, 3, and 4, and that calls out your M.2 slots. And typically, if you have slots that are faster than the others, usually your fastest slot or slots are the ones that are closest to the CPU, is the way they usually do that. So we've got a reinforced PCIe slot here. We've got 3 total slots, the large slots, and then we've got a small one here, and this one's reinforced. It used to be back several years ago when SLI or Crossfire were a big deal, and you had multiple cards, multiple graphics cards working together. It was really important to reinforce these, because when your motherboard is, sitting up like that, the weight of the cards could stress your PCIe slots. But since really most systems just use a single GPU anymore, they only reinforce, or they often only reinforce the top slot there. Okay, so we got 4 slots here. Again, this is for DDR4. They do make a version of this that supports DDR5, but this is the DDR4 version. So this is the socket for your USB 3.0 usually. Plugs into here. This is your 24-pin ATX main power supply. This little connector here is for your Type C USB connection, like that goes around to the front of your case or the top of your case. And I always point out these look like they are symmetrical, so you could put the cable in this way or that way, 180 off, but they're actually not. There's only one way your cable goes in there, so you really need to examine the end of the cable and I'll show that later, but you really need to make sure that when you plug that in, you got it plugged in the right way. And there are 6 SATA connections, so we got 4 here that are on the front plane of the board, or the top plane, and then we've got 2 here off to the side. They're sort of tucked under this heatsink a little bit, but there are 2 right here for a total of 6. Fan connections. People often want to know how many fan headers there are. So we've got 1 here. This is sysfan 3. We've got sysfan 4, sysfan 5, and sysfan 6 along the bottom. There's usually 1 over here, and there is. So this is sysfan 1. System fan 1. So you've got 1. Let's see, where is 2? We've got 3, so there's a 2 floating around here somewhere. Let's see. Okay, up here. So sysfan 2. So it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So those are your system fans. There are 6 of those, and it looks like up here we've got a CPU fan and the pump fan. So we've got 2 headers up there that are dedicated to that. We've got 2 headers over here for your RGB, and it's important to note 1 is 3 pins and 1 is 4 pins. They are not interchangeable because the voltage between these two, the supply voltage, is different, and that's why they make a 3 pin and a 4 pin, so you don't mix them up. The 3 pin here is usually what you use for your RGB effects on your accessories, so your CPU cooler, other CPU fans, things like that. This here would be like more for an RGB strip, and I'll talk about that a little more later, but just keep in mind they are not interchangeable. And sometimes there's another header down here along the bottom for that. Let's see. Okay, we've got one down here too. So this is your J Rainbow 1, and this is probably J Rainbow 2 up here. Actually, it says 3, so there's a second one floating around here somewhere. Let's see. It's a fan header. Oh, there they are right next to each other. J Rainbow 1, J Rainbow 2, J Rainbow 3 up here. Okay. And usually what I do, I haven't pulled the user manual out yet, but I take a look at it and sort of figure out what all the connectors are. These are just the basic ones that you would most likely use. There's a little switch right here that says off and on, and there's a little star next to it. So that might be to turn the RGB for the motherboard off right there, but I'll verify that. Some have it that way and some don't. This is your battery over here that keeps your CMOS settings, so you don't want to take that battery out unless you want to reset your CMOS settings. And I've had these things last. I just changed one on one of my Asus boards that's about 10 years, almost 10 years old, and I still had the battery in it, and it finally died here just a few months ago. So these things usually last a very long time. So as far as other things I see, if we look, I'm going to have to move the camera. And let's move the camera over here so we can see. All right, so there are 2 8-pin power connectors here. That's the power for the CPU, so you need to make sure your power supply has these connections available. All right, so now let's take a look at the I/O panel. And we did just look at this on the box just a moment ago, but it's nice to see it in person. But we've got over here are 2 ports. There's an HDMI port and there's a display port. Now these are only functional, or they're only active if you use a CPU that has the onboard graphics. So if you don't use that, then these are not functional, and you have to use a graphics card in one of your PCIe slots over here. So we've got our USB ports stacked here. These are USB 2.0, and right here this one has a little white box around it, and this is your flash BIOS. There's a little flash BIOS button right here, so if you want to update your BIOS, this is the port that you would do that from. And then we've got our 3 red USB ports, and then we've got your king of the hill here. This is your Type C. This is your 20 gigabit port right there. 2.5 gig on the LAN port, and we've got 2 Wi-Fi 6 Ethernet, or not Ethernet, Wi-Fi antennas. This is where you would connect your Wi-Fi antennas. And then these over here are your audio in and out, and we have one of the little, and I don't know how many people still use this, but this is your optical port. That little door pushes in and you can plug in an optical cable. This is your SPD F port right there. So that pretty much covers the bulk of what's going on with this motherboard. The only other thing that stands out that it doesn't have, usually up in this corner, is that little two-segment, or that two-digit multi-segment red LED Q code that shows what's going on with the motherboard as it boots up. But the MAGs, I don't know if any of the MAGs have that, but a lot of times, you know, again, since this is like your entry level or bottom tier, they don't have any frills or bells and whistles that the other tiers might have. And what I mean by the Q codes for the LEDs, if you're not familiar, oh, I said red LED, these are white on this motherboard, but if you look up there, and this is the Z690 Carbon Wi-Fi, and it does have that little feature up in the corner, but no big deal. And we've got the motherboard flipped over, and really what I wanted to point out here are these little white circles here, and it says avoid collision. And what that means is when you set your motherboard down on the studs in the case, you've got to be careful, because you can scrape the bottom of your motherboard and you can damage some of the little traces, and they can be quite close to these holes. So if you're putting your motherboard in and it slips, you just want to be real careful. And that's what they're basically saying. Don't have anything touching these areas. Now the very center here, and you can see the little, let me zoom in, these are meant to give an electrical contact to the studs, from the studs to the motherboard, so you're grounded. So you do want contact here with the studs in the very middle, but around here you don't. So just be careful. Okay, so what is in the box? Well, you get this little flash drive, and this usually has like your user manual and that sort of information on it. I'll verify that in a little bit. We've got a couple of SATA connectors, SATA cables. Looks like, oh, this is one of the little speed connectors for your M.2 drives, and I'll show that later. And it looks like some sort of stickers, heatsink deco stickers. Okay, so this must be to, yeah, I can see that shape there. Okay, so this, okay, that's cool. So you can decorate your heat sinks there with these little camo stickers. All right, that's cool. There you go. You got your very nice MSI badge. Cool. Quick installation guide. What's this? Oh, this is an M.2 locker. This is another one of those little quick connectors there for your M.2 drive. Again, I'll show that a little later here. This is, what is this? Okay, so this just shows you some other things in the MSI family of components, graphics cards, gaming gear, monitors, all that good stuff. And looks like some sort of competition here that you can enter. Join the reward program. And finally, user guide. Well, I remember when these things used to be almost a ½ inch thick. Now, as many systems as you may have built, and especially if you've never built a system before, it's really good to go through this and absorb as much of the information as you can. And if you have any questions, ask somebody who knows, or get online to the forums. Get all your questions answered, but I will certainly go through this myself, because I do have a couple of questions on a couple things on there, which I will get back to. All right, motherboard is flipped back over. I'm slowly getting everything connected. I've got some G-Skill, fairly slow memory just thrown in there to get things rolling. I've got to get the CPU and the cooler and a graphics card in there. Make sure the rest of my connections are good. I think I'll start off with this drive to boot from. I've got a copy of Windows 10 on there. We'll see how that goes. And then I think ultimately we'll get it upgraded to 11, and then we'll ultimately get everything on here to be the main boot drive. This is a very nice SK Hynix Gold P31 SSD, very fast, and we'll get it installed right here underneath this heatsink. Alright, so we'll get those screws out of there, and okay, so underneath what they have is a little thermal pad to transfer heat from your SSD to the heatsink. And usually what I do, if I'm not using the entire thermal pad, I'll just cut this little plastic protective, oops, wants to peel the thermal pad up with it. There we go. Usually I'll just peel off, whoops, there it goes again. Gotta be careful. Basically I'll just trim this down to what I need and leave the rest to protect the thermal pad so it doesn't get a bunch of fuzz and dirt stuck to it. So I just make a cut just through the liner. Careful not to cut into the thermal pad there. Now this is just something I do. You do not have to do this. You can just peel the whole thing off. There we go. But that's how I do it. And we'll get the drive installed. There we go. And sort of pops in there. And there's a little retention screw right here. And let's see, I gotta get a screwdriver that size. Alright, we got that on there. And yes, I do have my anti-static wrist strap on. I didn't earlier, but I wasn't really handling anything on the motherboard. Okay, so we'll get that screwed down, and always be really careful when you have a screwdriver around your motherboard. It's very easy to slip off. And you don't want to run a screwdriver down on top of your motherboard. There we go. Alright, so we're ready to put the CPU in. And like I say, I always like to do a real quick pin inspection, and I don't see anything that looks out of the ordinary. Everything looks good. So now we're ready for the CPU. And the CPU is in there. You can see there's already thermal paste on it because I pulled it off of my Z690 Carbon Wi-Fi DDR4 motherboard. So we'll be using the same 12700 KF CPU. But again, what I wanted to point out, and like I did on that motherboard review, you can see the little notches there, 2 notches, and then there are 2 more notches up here, 1 there and 1 there. They line up with the tabs on the socket so that the CPU can only fit in there one way. And there's a little gold triangle on the lower left corner. So if I get this to stay in focus, that's what the CPU looks like. So we'll lock it down and I'll get the cooler on there. Alright, so the Windows 10 installation went without any issues. I'm getting some of the basics installed now, getting all the drivers on there. And I used the Microsoft installation tool to make a bootable USB drive there. And the installation went smoothly. Alright, so we have Windows 10 installed, no issues. I used the Microsoft tool to make a bootable flash drive there, and that worked. And then I used the MSI supplied flash drive. It has all of your drivers and all that good stuff to get things rolling. And once you do that, then you can go online and get the latest and greatest. But no issues, so I'll get a few more things installed and updated, and then we'll move on to Windows 11. Alright, Windows 11 is installed, no issues. The big challenge now is just getting all of the apps updated, getting all of the drivers installed, all that good stuff. If you didn't know already, Windows 11 is actually optimized to work with the Alder Lake CPUs. So I've used this particular CPU in my other system over here with Windows 10 and 11, and I just got 11 on this system. But I did not have any problems making the transition, and I didn't really see that big of a difference performance-wise. I did some gaming on the other system, a little bit, but using it as a daily driver or light gaming, heavy gaming, I didn't really notice much difference. Of course, as the software matures and as the platform matures and we come out with future generations of the Intel CPUs, I'm sure that there will be more optimization to take advantage of whatever the new CPUs offer. And right now, if you've got a valid copy of Windows 10 running, the upgrade, at least for now, to Windows 11 is still free, so why not? And I'll throw up a slide here in a moment with the system specs for what I'm using on this particular system. Now, I mentioned earlier there's a little switch right here, and if you watch the fans there on the cooler in the background and then on the pump in the middle there, I can turn the switch off and it turns off the RGB effects to those two units. As you can see, the graphics card, it does not affect, and the RAM it does not affect. So it only controls the stuff that is really just plugged in here on this J-Rainbow header. And in a little bit here, I'll bring some of the BIOS screens up and we'll sort of look at those. Let's see. Oh, the Wi-Fi, that's what I wanted to talk about. So this has Wi-Fi 6, not 6E. The other motherboard I looked at, the Carbon, Z690 Carbon Wi-Fi, it has Wi-Fi 6E. So what's the difference between Wi-Fi 6 and Wi-Fi 6E? Well, 6E just gives you a dedicated band, a 6 gigahertz band. So your Wi-Fi 6, you still have your 2.4 gigahertz and your 5 gigahertz, but Wi-Fi 6E gives you that extra band, 6 gigahertz band. So that's a whole different story, talking about the differences between 6E and 6. But this particular motherboard, the Tomahawk, only has Wi-Fi 6, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I have the XMP profile enabled for the RAM. That takes advantage of your really the maximum performance without having to go in and do a lot of tweaking and overclocking on your own. You just enable the XMP profile and most of the work is really done for you. Alright, so I've got the BIOS screen up. I'll get the camera set on the tripod so it's not moving all over as I talk about it. But you might be wondering why this fan is just sitting here. And when I've got the motherboard sitting out in the open like this, since there's not really a lot of air circulating across it, like you would have if this was installed in a case, I just sort of set this fan up here as a way to just keep a little bit of air moving across the motherboard. So, alright, let me get this thing mounted. Okay, so I'm just going to go very briefly through some of the basics here on the Bioscreen. If you're new to building a system, you get into the BIOS typically by spamming the delete key. So as soon as the system boots up, just start hitting that delete key and that should bump you into the BIOS. If you're seasoned at getting into the BIOS and making tweaks and changes, well then you already know what to do. Okay, so here's the main BIOS screen. Now if you're familiar with the BIOS on this motherboard or other motherboards, then you know what to do, you know where to go, you know what settings need to be changed. If you're not familiar with the BIOS, then there are two modes up here. There's easy mode and advanced mode. You can toggle the button or you can hit your F7 on your keyboard. But this is your advanced mode here. This is where you get into a lot of the deep settings, especially, for example, like if you're going to do overclocking and you want to make all your tweaks and adjustments. If you've never overclocked or you're not sure about overclocking, then I would recommend really just staying out of it. Stay here in the easy mode. Overclocking, you've got the gain boost. This applies a mild overclock to the system. Sort of the settings are canned. It's really for anybody who really doesn't understand overclocking, but you want to try some overclocking, so you can use the gain boost. There's an XMP profile here that you can enable or disable. I recommend enabling it, assuming your memory supports it, which most memory these days does support it. We've got two profiles here. This one's grayed out, so my guess is this memory kit only supports one XMP profile, which is fine. But again, here in the easy mode, all of your basic information is here, and there's not a lot of details here. You can go in and adjust your fan profiles for how you want your fans to behave. You can also control that through software in the operating system, or you can let the BIOS do it. So again, if you're familiar with the BIOS, then you can go into here, the advanced mode, and you can make all of your tweaks and adjustments. And if you're not, I would stick to the easy mode, and the default settings, like I said, should be just fine for most people to get their system up and running. Okay, so I went ahead and put the motherboard in this case, and we've got several MSI goodies here to show off. The first one here is the GM41, Clutch GM41 mouse. It has some nice RGB effects there. And the case is the Secura 500p. So there's the box for the mouse. And then for the graphics card, we're using the GeForce RTX 2070 Super from MSI. Got to get down a little lower there to see the RGB effects there. For the cooler, you can see the nice RGB fans there, and then the pump housing. Actually, the pump is in the radiator, but you'll see that in the review for the MAG Core Liquid C280, and this one is made to handle the new socket from Intel, which is the LGA 1700. And then the power supply, which is behind the shroud here. It's a little hard to see, but it is the MAG A750 GF. So we have quite a number of goodies here from MSI in this system. And I really like the glass panels here on this case, but there's so much reflection to really see what's going on. I have to open the doors. Now this cooler here, this is a 280 millimeter cooler. It's the new cooler there. Again, it's the MAG Core Liquid C280. And it fits nicely in the top of this case, but it would also fit nicely in the front. There's plenty of room for it. Now, one thing I wanted to point out real quick. So if you look at your I/O panel up here, your USB-C port there, it connects to the motherboard. Right here to this connector right in there. Let me zoom in a little better on that. So that's that connector that I was showing you earlier, that or that socket I should say. It looks like it's symmetrical on first glance, so you might think you can plug your cable in either way. And actually, let me show you what the cable looks like in more detail. So you can see, like I said, on first glance it looks like it's symmetrical. You could flip it over either way, but if you look at it more closely, you'll see that it is actually not symmetrical. Right here where my thumbnail is, that lower left corner, you can see that's a little shorter than the corner over here on the right. And there's some other subtle differences, but I don't know why they would make a connector and socket like that, because if you push hard enough, you can actually push this in the wrong way. So I'm just telling you this so that pay attention to it and make sure you get it plugged in the right way. And this is not an MSI thing. Everybody makes the same connector here, same cable, regardless of the case manufacturer, and the connector on the motherboard is going to be the same regardless of the motherboard manufacturer. And all of these items complement each other nicely in this system. And the next thing I'll show is the Mystic Light. So actually there's ambient light, but there's the Mystic Light functionality, and that really handles your components such as your graphics card, your CPU cooler, your motherboard itself, and there are actually some RGB effects here on the mouse. And you can control all of these items together. You can link them so that they all change their colors separately. You can go in there and modify them. You can turn them off if you don't want any RGB effects going on. Or you can link them all together. So any changes that I make, it's sort of a global change. And you can see what's happening here. This is actually a graphical representation of what's actually happening. So if I were to come over here and turn everything off, all of the, give it a moment, there we go, all of the RGB effects there turn off, with the exception of the RAM. The RAM is not controlled by the Mystic Light, so you would have to go in and turn that off separately. And in this case, since this is Corsair memory, I would have to get into the iQ software and control the RGB there. But there are other brands of RAM that you would see the symbol show up here, and you can control it with the Mystic Light. But the Corsair RAM there seems to be a little different animal. Let me go ahead and turn it back on. And it should come on in a moment. It takes it a moment to kick back on. Let's see. So everything here should be on. Yep, and it is. All right, wrapping this up here, I will show this off real quick. This will have its own separate review, so keep your eyes out for that. But this is the new Spatium M480 Play from MSI. And looky there, it's got the PCIe 4.0 connectivity, 2 terabytes, 7,000 megabytes a second on the read speeds. So we'll look at this in a separate review coming up real soon. So back to the motherboard. So what really draws me to this motherboard is the fact that you get the latest Z690 chipset for an Intel CPU, but you can still use your old DDR4 memory. So you don't have to go out and you can upgrade to the Z690, but you don't have to upgrade to DDR5 memory on this particular motherboard. You can use your old DDR4, repurpose it, reuse it however you want to work that. But you know, DDR4 is still plentiful. It's still relatively inexpensive, and you know, the performance difference between DDR4 and DDR5 is not really huge. It's nothing that would necessarily move you to a DDR5 platform based on that alone. And that brings me to the pricing. So right now on Amazon, this is showing up as $269. The retail price of the original list was $299, so you get a little bit of a discount there. Always keep your eyes open on Amazon and Newegg because they have sales and prices are changing from time to time. But you know, $269 for this motherboard, I think, is a really decent price. And when you combine that with the latest solid state drive and M.2 drive, maybe this one for example, even with a mid-range or a lower-end CPU, you're still going to have a screaming fast system. So like I said, the DDR4 is impressive. The other thing I like, you got the 2.5 gigabit on your Ethernet port there for your LAN. It's Wi-Fi 6. It's not Wi-Fi 6E, but that certainly is not a deal breaker. So overall, I would give this the Overclockers Club Editor's Choice Award. So this is Chris with Overclockers Club. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.